Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to those of you from different locations watching in. Really warm welcome to everyone to today's webinar and conversation. Just a quick introduction. My name is Ben Sukia. I'm a client success manager here at Zero Global. I think I'll start by just giving some of you an introduction as to who we are as a company for those of you who might not be aware. We are a company that exists to empower global mobility teams to move people seamlessly across borders with end-to-end legal and professional support. Our expertise is really quite holistic. We cover everything from navigating complex visa and government requirements to providing more specific regulatory insights. We also offer AI capabilities within our service stream. In addition to that, our technology platform is around really to support clients with centralizing and simplifying mobility, compliance, and workforce management, making cross-border operations efficient, transparent, and as stress-free as possible. So before I begin the webinar, I've been informed by our marketing manager that I really have to press upon you some housekeeping. So before we dive into the content, I'm just going to go over a few quick items to make sure things run as smoothly as possible. Just so that you're aware, we are recording this webinar, of course. So if anyone has to miss any part or you have to jump out for any reason, we are going to be sharing the webinar after the event. So you'll also receive a link to the recording after the session. Look, we really want lots of engagement, so great to see some of you people writing in the chat already. Keep that up. We'd love to have some comments and questions, and we'll revisit that towards the end of the session. If there are any technical issues, if there are any audio issues or video problems, please just try and refresh your page if you can. If that doesn't help, all you need to do is just reach out in the chat and someone from our support team will reach out to you. And finally, we're absolutely huge on social media. We love it. So Instagram and LinkedIn. If you have any thoughts or questions or takeaways, please do tag us at Zero Global so we can see what you have to say and engage with you on LinkedIn or Instagram. So really looking forward to the conversation today. I am going to start by bringing in our speakers. So if we can bring onto the stage Attica Ahmed. Attica, hey, how are you doing? You're on mute.
Yes.
Lovely to see you, Attica. Attica is the International Assignments Partner at Hitachi Energy, a fantastic speaker with so much experience. Attica, are you happy to just give a quick introduction to the audience as to your experience and your insight and in the industry so far?
Yes. So thank you, Ben, for the introduction. So I have been part of global mobility since 2015. And today I'm really excited to be part of this webinar because this is something that is really close to my heart. And because not because it is important for our planet, but it's also because there is not much being done in global mobility in general when it comes to sustainability. So, and we are not on the table to discuss this with the companies, with the organizations as such, as how we can contribute towards the reduction of the emissions. So that is why this topic is really close to me, and I am very happy today to be part of this webinar. Thanks to Zero Global.
Amazing. Thank you, Attica. Really looking forward to the conversation. I think it's about time we bring on our second speaker. Hi, Josh. We have Josh Stones here, who is a global mobility specialist at Swire Renewable Energy. Josh, welcome to the conversation. It would be lovely if you could just give a quick introduction in terms of your background and experience in the industry so far.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the introduction, Ben. To give you all of you here today a bit of an introduction on myself. I've spent the sort of best part of just over 3 years now working in the global mobility world, coming from an RMC background and having experience of working with many different clients, particularly within the tech and pharmaceutical side of things, before moving into my current role now, where I work within a renewable energy company itself. And I think it's quite a fitting topic to be speaking about, as a lot of what my company does and exists to do is about serving the future and doing so in a renewable and a sustainable way. But a lot of the time in those conversations, global mobility is almost left out of that. And I do believe that it's very important for us to have global mobility, not just for the purposes that it serves, because I do believe that in terms of the future and going forward, it's really important for us to have those connections and those to be taking place all around the world. But we need to be conscious of in the way that we're doing that. And I think that's a great place for this platform and the conversation that we're going to be having today.
Amazing. Thank you, Josh. It's really great to have you both part of this conversation. And it's something that I've been passionate about for a number of years now. Just to introduce the topic, I really want to give the stage to both of you, because when we had this planning conversation, it was almost like the panel could have gone live on the very first call, quite frankly. But the title of the conversation is Driving Towards Net Zero, How Global Mobility is Shaping the Future. So I think the very first question that we should begin with is, for those of you new to this theme or relatively new to this theme, is what actually is net zero. And I'll start by giving the UK explanation as to how that's defined. And essentially what it is the attempt to cut down carbon emissions to 0% by 2050, with the starting point of when it was at 100% in 1990. So that's a huge goal. We're obviously almost at 2025 now, so we're about 25 years off that, and it's a good point to reevaluate where we are. Some of the key principles that were looked at with the objectives we're trying to achieve with that is, for example, front-loading emission reductions, being more cautious about the use of carbon dioxide storage, and some sort of regulation in terms of carbon offsets. So it's a really big goal, but it's something that lots of organisations are looking to more and more on the basis of regulations that have come in, and we're going to dive into those a bit later on. But we're going to approach this webinar, this conversation, to three parts. The first, which we'll discuss, will be the challenges of achieving net zero, and looking as to how that looks in global mobility. I think one of the key things to think about here is our industry, and I've been in it for sort of 10 to 15 years now, is focused on travel. It specifically involves the movement of people relocating, whether short or long term, from one place to another. So how does that marry up? How does that match up with the idea of reducing carbon emissions when the very nature of the industry requires people quite frequently to get on planes to do their jobs? So we're going to explore that and the struggles that we're currently facing. But we're then going to move on to look at the situation in terms of regulations and policies. And I want to hone in on the next 5 years, specifically looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, which were aimed to be finalised by 2030. But also something that maybe some of you aren't as familiar with is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So we'll dig into that a little bit more. And then finally, of course, the purpose of the conversation is to find solutions and see what Attica and Josh might be able to suggest in terms of what your companies could be doing to help the cause, essentially. So we're going to dig a bit deeper into that. But I think, first of all, it'd really be great to see what Attica and Josh have got to say in terms of the challenges that they face in achieving net zero and some of the problems that they currently face. So perhaps if we start with you, Attica, it would be great to hear a bit more.
Yes, thank you for introducing the topic so well, Ben. But I might just add a little bit of clarification for people who are new to this topic. Because net zero is actually a situation where the global greenhouse gas emissions that are contributed from human activity are balanced with the emission reduction. And so that's what when you mentioned that the carbon dioxide emissions are still generated, but then they are removed from the atmosphere, and the end result is the zero increase in net emissions. But when it comes to global mobility, and the axiom has been fixed for some time now that global mobility only touches 1 or 2% of the total workforce. And that means that organizations actually start focusing more towards other carbon intensive activities like business travels, because that, like you mentioned, transport is actually uh, contributing to two-thirds. The second largest contributor to emissions is transport. So obviously the business focuses on that. But global mobility increasingly wants a seat at the table, because global mobility is also part of the scope 3 emissions, I mean the processes. So coming back a little bit, the emissions are actually categorized into three scopes. So scope 1 and scope 2 are direct emissions, and where global mobility's life cycle is involved, it's more the scope 3 emissions. And the scope 3 emissions are the indirect emissions. And when we think about our process, it lies mainly in the supply chain, and it would be shipment of goods, furniture allowance. Ben and Josh, I would share with you that I was extremely shocked to have my thoughts shaken that furniture allowance is not better than shipment, because I always thought that, oh, furniture allowance is better than shipment, but it's not, because in terms of figures, an average piece of furniture actually generates 47 kgs of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's not a better solution. But then there is business travel as part of our assignment. There is home leave travel. There is also accommodation and the pre-assignment travels. Those are certain broad categories in which we see that we have our emissions. And yeah, and Josh, I would leave the stage to you to also comment on this.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Atika. And I think that's a very important point, right? That a lot of what we're doing, it's unavoidable that there'll be emissions caused by the actions within global mobility. That's not going to go away. And through COVID, we've learned through webinars like this that maybe some of the business travel can be reduced and we can have more conversations online in this matter. But a lot of what we do, it's unavoidable. I look at what's going on in the renewable energy space right now, and certain parts of the world are ahead of other parts of the world. It's unavoidable that there will be movement between some countries because, simply put, there isn't talent all over the world for certain fields. And that will mean that there's always going to be a problem of how to address the sort of climate situation that we currently find ourselves in, and looking at ways of either reducing how much we're actually impacting, and that can be done in a number of different ways. And Atika, I know we've spoken quite a lot about furniture allowance as a prime example of that, whereby, what actually is the best solution to that, because I think every company you ask maybe have a different opinion on that, and that's also sometimes why the conversation needs to be had with those that are moving, and it shouldn't just be a company making a decision on behalf of all of its employees. They need to be involved in that conversation too, and actually speaking up for themselves and saying, I don't want to have such a large input in that. In some certain situations, maybe it does make sense for a family that wants to have a furniture allowance. Maybe they're moving from one country where it's pretty standard to be renting an apartment with everything included. But if you're moving to a new location where that isn't the standard, well then actually is it really in your best interest to not have that? Or is a shipment maybe the best case? Or is it about reducing the size of the shipment that we consider? And these are all some of the policy questions that we have to ask ourselves when we're putting together the packages for employees that are going away, be it for a short term or a long term, and having those conversations about that. And I think that also leads into one of the other big problems that we've discussed as well previously to this webinar, on actually collecting all this data.
Yeah.
As you can tell, it's not that easy just to collect all the information about the global mobility life cycle. There's typically lots of different vendors involved in the process, and actually collecting all the data from them separately in a way that's recordable and measurable across the board for your company, that's often one of the biggest challenges we face. Is, do we truly have the data to make the best decisions for us within our best interests when we're getting data from several different vendors who might present it in all slightly different ways? And I think that's one of the biggest problems as well with making the best informed decisions.
That's really interesting, Josh. And just to go back a couple of points that you made there, you mentioned when we were planning this as well, the profile of the assignees is changing, where assignees are actually specifically saying that this is important to them on an individual basis. So it's not just about the companies and what they're doing, but also individuals are seeking to kind of focus on this in terms of where they're looking to move. But obviously at Swire, you focus on renewable energy. Is there much dialogue, and how does that work when it comes to an international move in terms of discussing that as part of the move?
Yeah, I think it's always involved in the conversation, and it's quite interesting sitting within the renewable energy sector because the purpose of the moves and the assignments that we're agreeing to are in nature typically good for the planet. You know, we'll be going to work on wind farms around the world, but a lot of the time they don't want to be going away for long times of periods of time away from their family. They're going to be working on vessels all around the world. And that's also another conversation to be had about, you know, home leave. It's two-sided because you might on one side be saying that in the future we're looking at improving our opinions towards working for the climate, but then there's also
Yeah.
the mental health side of things. It's difficult to be being away from home from your family for extended periods of time. And right now, when we're sort of expanding into new markets in Asia and into Africa as well, and you're asking those that already have maybe the knowledge and the talent needed to come from Europe to these places, they're
Yeah.
not necessarily always moving on a permanent relocation. Some of these are short-term assignments, and they still actually want to be able to have that home leave option and going back and seeing their family. And that's where it becomes a difficult decision at times of how much does this go against what our core beliefs are, and versus what is the right thing to be doing in that situation.
That's really an interesting point, Josh, as well. That, you know, assignments are different in terms of duration and what we can do from a short-term perspective if it's a short-term trip, or what kind of action is taken if it's a longer-term trip as well. I mean, one example of that is if it's short-term travel, are there other means of traveling? You know, can you take the train? There's a less of a carbon offset with that versus a plane. So it is interesting to see what options are available, but also considering the different types of move that we have in global mobility. Attica, when we were sort of having these prep calls, you made the really important point of how critical RMCs are to achieving net zero. And I'm curious to know if you'd be able to elaborate on that in terms of the role they play and what dialogue can be engaged in terms of achieving some of the targets we're trying to set ourselves to get to net zero. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Yes, because when we talk about the supply chain, we have an extensive supply chain and then sub supply chains, and they all contribute to the overall carbon footprint. And the networks are actually quite complex, and we do not have any metrics available, or we do not even ask that at the time of when we are onboarding a supplier, what are their sustainability goals? We do not ask that. That is not part of our agenda. And that is, for me, that is what is missing, that sustainability is missing in all different levels of global mobility conversations. Like Josh made a very good point, that assignees are coming and talking about what is a more sustainable option. So global mobility has a pressure for following the environmental, social and development, governance standards. At the same time, from internally, we are also having the pressure from the changing demographic who is expecting from us this change. And major emissions, and if we see in our assignment life cycle, come from the supply chain. And how to actually address it would be to actually have active conversations with our supply chain when we onboard them from the start itself. When we onboard a supplier, we have to make sure that they are clear in their sustainability goals. They are the way that they procure things have less carbon footprint, and how are their practices. And then we have to also ask them for their reports. A lot of RMCs have their sustainability reports. They're doing very well in that. So it's not that it's not available in the market. The technology is there, the solutions are there, and we as a company or a global mobility program should be the one to ensure that they are provided, those metrics are provided to us on a certain standard. Only then we can actually look on, like Josh said, when we don't measure, we don't know. So unless we measure, then we do a benchmarking, and then we look at the solutions. So that is how it should follow, that once we have to measure first what are the supply chain, what kind of emission reduction efforts that they are making, and then go from there.
Yeah, absolutely, Attica and Josh. The other issue is I'm curious to know if your companies focus a bit on it, or the increasing focus on when there's an RFP, the information that's been requested from these vendors and the providers as to what companies are doing. Is that something that you ask for when you're going out to tender and you're looking to partner with other suppliers? What's your current position on it now, and do you think that's likely to increase as time goes by in terms of more and more metrics being asked to be provided? I'd love to know both of your thoughts on that. Attica, maybe if you want to go first.
Yeah. Yes, so we don't have that process in place right now. And also, I would like to also go a little back when we talked about policy. No policy is carbon free. So whether it is short term or long term or local plus, every policy would have a carbon footprint of some extent. So what we need to focus in global mobility is how can we bring a policy to ensure emission reduction, and like we have estimates for sorry, I'm going away from the supplier side, but when we come to even in our program, when we have like cost estimates prepared, we don't have cost for sustainability. We should include, my thought is that we should have a sustainability cost, and for each assignment, let's say the business also invest in some NGO program to replant trees. So things like these, they should be the sustainability sustainability agenda should be in our DNA, should be in each and every step. So of course, supply side, which we see obviously that they have a larger impact, definitely have, we need to streamline our processes right from the start. We need to be prepared when we will be asked, when, like you mentioned about CSRD, we will be asked about those metrics to be reported in the coming years, and CSRD is also applicable wherever our assignee is. It's not just where the home and host is. It's applicable wherever our employee is. So we have to make sure that we are sustainable in our supply chain management, and we should have a supply chain transparency. So we should have a view on what are the sustainable practices and processes that are being followed by our supply chain. And I think it's also the ask. When we will ask, then we will, and if it is not available, then they will make it available, because the technology and the tools are there to assess it for the RMCs. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's a great segue actually into the middle part of our discussion, in terms of us looking where we are now and ahead to the next 5 years. And there are kind of two, I suppose, advisory. Well, one's advisory, the next is actual legislation that I think will shape how we approach essentially the next 25 years. But I think we should look at the next 5 years ahead. The first being, I'm sure many of you watching are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, which was obviously introduced by the United Nations in 2015. That was 9 years ago, with the objective of reaching 17 goals by 2030. There are a number of them obviously to do with climate change and improving clean energy, clean water. A number of them were specifically focused on, improving environmental issues around the world that we have. Obviously, we're only a few years away from that now, and some of the narrative around that is that it's unlikely that we'll meet those goals by 2030. But the other important piece of legislation that we need to think about is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. So for those of you who aren't familiar, that was a directive that was implemented by the European Union. It's already come into effect this year in 2024, just about 4 months ago now or so, in July 2024. It will have a phased implementation, but for those of you that are less familiar with it, what it essentially exists, the purpose of it is essentially to put some sort of regulation in terms of monitoring environmental, social, and governance issues, so that they can be tracked by companies at a corporate level, And also it will include some form of auditing, that companies will be audited in terms of their ESG initiatives. So it's really quite significant. What I would say is that it will have a phased implementation. So from next year, some companies will have to adhere to those CSRD initiatives, although it is going to spread across the next 4 years. So there is time. It's something that will be phased gradually over the next 4 years. What it does mean is that companies are going to need to really pay more attention to what they're doing. They're going to need to get some guidance and advice as to what they need to legally do to meet the legislation of the CSRD. I'd like to spend a few minutes now exploring what the impact that might be on the global mobility industry and specifically for the companies that Josh and Attica work for. So maybe we'll start with you, Josh, and I'm curious to know your overall thoughts on the directive.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think ultimately it's for the best having the directive in place, and it pushes the agenda a lot more and makes it less of a choice to be doing the right thing for a lot of companies. And I think that's always an important step. And within our industry, it's obviously something that we have a particular high interest in, working within the energy space and particularly within the renewable energy space. And because of that, we've been trying to be on this from the jump and try to be ahead of the curve in that essence. And sort of just coming on to what we were last speaking about regarding RFPs, I think it's made it so our sustainability team are a lot more involved in that process and wanting to see some of the information that can actually be provided. Where we sit within our company, we do have a small amount of business travel, but actually the large amount of our travel is related to assignments, particularly some of the short-time assignments. So recently when we were looking at selecting a travel provider, one of the sort of things that we did within the company was be very involved in actually having a look at what reporting information was available for us on the sustainability side, and actually spending time and saying, look, one of the things that's very important to us is we want to actually see the reporting deck, see what information you can provide to us, and actually bringing our sustainability team into that conversation rather than it just being something that Global Mobility or whoever it may be involved in other people's companies to have that conversation, but actually looking at it across the organization as well. And I think that's something as more and more companies develop a sustainability team of some form or another, it's about working very closely with them rather than sort of every company having its own function, particularly within Global Mobility, that works independently, it gets its thing done. It actually has these conversations as a wider team in preparation for a lot of the actions that need to be taken.
Attica, you're nodding your head. It sounds like you have some comments to add to that.
No, I completely agree with Josh. But yes, I do have a comment that, even though the directive it started, the reporting will be presented from next year onwards, 2025, right? It covers for 2024 as well. But we need to, if I look at myself, my company and Global Mobility Program, I can honestly say that we've just started to think about it. And we have to be ESG compliant, environmental, social, and governance compliant. And so to make our program as ESG compliant, we have to review the guidelines, our processes, our contracts, and we have to identify those weak points and take action to make it more business attractive as well as employee attractive at the same time. And there are a few points that I just want to highlight here about ESG. Again, it is very important to measure and assess there are ESG metrics, and we have to measure ourselves and where our global mobility program is as of now. What is as a situation? So metrics, of course, is important in everything. Then there are many companies who actually do the ESG maturity assessment. So they actually compare where your company is and in comparison to the others in the same industry of the same size, and then will give you some suggestions on how to become more with their customized recommendations for our program. And the most important part is that we should have ESG awareness training. We don't have that as part of our program. We should at least start with the ESG awareness training. There are a lot of tools and programs which run those ESG awareness trainings. And I would suggest that we should take it with a sense of urgency, because it's even when coming to net zero, the we are actually very soon, if we move at the current pace that we are moving, we are going to exhaust our carbon things that we have right now. So that we are going to like exhaust our carbon budget basically. And that means that we have to take actions, and we have to take actions in every unit of the organization. So like me and Josh agree that global mobility cannot be insulated from the discussion. It has to be a cross-functional discussion. It has to be a collaboration within the company, together with the sustainability teams, to achieve those targets. And that is, I think it requires collaboration on all fronts and with all stakeholders to achieve our ESG targets, and therefore have a good reporting for the CSRD.
That's really interesting. I've got a question for you. I'm going to be cynical. And now there's a requirement, obviously, a legal requirement, obviously, to start focusing on this, as we've discussed. I can see you're both incredibly passionate about this topic from a human level, because we all care about the environment. However, if I was the CEO of a company that was just looking at financials, just looking at the numbers, how would you respond if my question to you was, great, we all care about the planet, but at the end of the day, I want to know what the bottom line is. I want to know about the numbers. What about that? What about how is this going to help me from a profitability standpoint? Or is it going to actually cost me money? Just want to put it out there. I'm curious to know what your response would be, Attica and Josh.
Yeah, of course. All the net zero technologies are very expensive. And the main one of the main challenges actually, Ben, is this approach of a short-term financial perspective rather than long-term sustainability goals. What we are trying to build, or let's say it's a CEO of an important company, but if we keep having natural calamities because of climate change, can this organization sustain their development or their activities around the world? It impacts everyone. So climate change is not sparing anyone. So if we don't have long-term sustainability goals, it definitely requires a behavioral shift, of moving from short-term financial gains to long-term sustainability goals, which align with our Paris Climate Agreement and such.
Absolutely. Josh, I will ask you just briefly before I do so, though, we'd love to have some questions from the audience. I know we've got a few coming in already. Just a reminder, thanks, Nicole, for putting that message in. But any more questions, please do jump in. We'll have 5 more minutes, and then we'll move on to the question section. But Josh, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that comment that I made previously.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. It's what's more effective, the carrot or the stick, right? And I think often is the case with global mobility. It's often viewed as purely as an expense to any business. It's not seen as something that's necessarily directly adding value. And I think that's kind of the behavioral shift that needs to be done. And maybe global mobility can have some role in that in terms of how it gets creative with its policies and decisions that it makes, and being flexible. But I think it comes from all different levels. It's saying to those that are saying only caring about the bottom line, well, actually, if you care about sustainability, well, this is going to have other benefits for you. What we're seeing a lot now in a lot of the work that we potentially bid on is the sustainability is also a question being asked by our clients that we work with, and they want to know, well, what are you actually going to do to be more sustainable, and showing that you're taking the steps. And sometimes that can be the difference in winning work or not. There's that side of it, but then also within global mobility, sort of specifically as well, it's about making decisions that are showing that actually people that we're relocating and working with care about this as well. And where I've seen a lot of success with this, and what a lot of RMCs will do if you sort of reach out to them and get in touch, is asking them to sort of benchmark some of the best practices that they're seeing around this. And what a lot of the time you'll see is actually some of the most successful policies that are regarded internally within companies are those that offer a level of flexibility. And a lot of the time, that flexibility helps lead to sort of decisions being made by the assignee that actually benefits the climate, because a lot of those that are moving now tend to be of the younger generation, millennials and Gen Zs, and they're wanting to be very active about this. And they're able to actually look at their policy and look at all the options that they're being offered. Maybe your relocation has a budget per se that you're sticking to, but then they have different options of flexibility within that. And maybe sometimes that means they're making choices for smaller shipments. They are making decisions to include within their package the option of offsetting their travel costs, which is an option that some sort of companies are offering right now. And I think it's about being flexible within that and working within the constraints of, okay, well, maybe we only have this much budget to work with, but some of the decisions that we're making are climate positive and it's getting a positive uptake as well.
That's really interesting, Josh. It's so interesting to see that the individuals, sometimes it's the individuals that create the change, and the current demographics might actually, help fight the cause of reaching this target of net zero. I want to add my 2 cents to the conversation as well. I have an immigration background. I've worked in immigration side of global mobility, and I think we're also seeing some reason or seeds of hope in the fact that more processes are becoming more streamlined and less paper driven, from the supplier side as well, which is great. So you'll have more and more governments actually having online systems where you file online or an e-visa application instead of having to physically use paper. Now, it started in sort of certain countries in, the US with the ESTA or Canada with the ETA, but more and more countries are introducing this electronic system of filing. You can do so in the US now as well with the LCA. But I do think even on that side of things, it is helping to reduce, for example, the use of paper. So I do think this increasing digitization of immigration processes is also, a small but a significant step in terms of reaching that goal of net zero. We should probably move on to sort of the final of the 3 parts of this discussion, and that really is looking at the solutions. I mean, people are obviously watching in to find out what they can do individually or at a business level to reach this target of net zero for many different reasons. So I'd love to hear both some ideas from both of you, but also some possible case studies. I know we talked, maybe I'll start with you, Josh. You had a really great example about the shipment that you wanted to refer to. So perhaps you could touch on that. But it'd be great to have some thoughts from you both in terms of what solutions are available, in terms of what companies could do in terms of strategic planning. So Josh, perhaps we'll start with you.
Yeah, of course. I think we've touched on it a little bit already in regards to shipments, because I think often within global mobility and the benefits offered, that can be one of the highest impact ones. And it really is the sort of conversation of what is actually the best case scenario for each individual assignee. And that's where the flexibility that I spoke about earlier can be quite important within policies for each individual to look at their circumstances and decide what's best. We've spoken already about the furniture allowance, but there's also other benefits that can be offered to assignees, and that can include options sort of like a discard and donate, where you're actually having the support of someone to come into your home and say, look, here are all the things that I'm planning on not taking with me. I don't know what to do with them. And they can actually spend the time of helping you decide what is truly rubbish and can't be saved in that instance, and what can actually be donated and used in better places. And they'll actually support you doing that. They'll come to your home and collect all those items. I think that can sometimes be a really big difference, is actually having someone involved in that process and thinking about it. In other cases, it could be deciding between a furniture allowance or maybe a shipment, also then deciding between how big of a shipment do you truly need. Is it going to be an air shipment? Is it going to be a sea shipment? And actually also sometimes the global mobility team coming in and having those conversations with assignees, because you'll see some I've seen many cases where people have said, I want to get my stuff there as quickly as possible. They're leaders for large companies, and they say, I want an air shipment. And then you actually have the conversation with them, explaining what the customs process might look like in the country that they're moving to, and how long it might take them to find a new home. And then they very quickly realize, well, actually, maybe I should just go for a sea shipment in this case, because an air shipment, is not really going to get me my items there any sooner, any quicker. And I think that's some of the conversations. It's about working out what's best for the individual in their circumstances, and actually having them have that thought of mind to consider what's best.
That's really, really interesting, Josh. Thanks. Attica, you're nodding your head again. I feel like you're bursting to give us your thoughts. So I would love to hear what you have to say.
You get my cue because we actually did something. So I want to share that. So a few years back, we have a short-term policy and a long-term policy, and as part of the short-term policy, we had the benefit of giving the assignee 1 cubic meter of air freight. But we realized that, especially after pandemic, and there was so much stoppages along the way, that the carbon footprint and the cost of that benefit was really, really high, and it was not conducive to carry on. So we actually started to have, that was a tipping point for the global mobility specialist or international assignment partners in our company to start having those discussions with the employee, that what would you prefer, like Josh said, what makes sense, what is logical. So as per policy, we have a certain, for like a fit container for family move, but does that person really need that? But yeah, coming back to this air freight, we removed it. We had discussions with the employee and they were all okay with it. I'm not saying that the carbon footprint is not there with the excess baggage that we gave instead, but it's still less than what it was. So we have to go for small wins here, because we cannot change everything all at once. We cannot change all the policies, all the processes, the way we have emissions, a lot of carbon emissions in the supply chain. We can't do everything at the same time. But what we can do is to start small, step by step, and to improve our processes. And when it comes to air travel, actually, what we can do is to, even though the cost is going to go higher, of course, for the business, and that is also one of the questions that Zofia has asked, that what would be the impact for assignee and business if we follow net zero? The cost absolutely will be going up for the business. But if it's a business like us, Hitachi Energy, who has committed to those goals to reach the to not let the global temperature increase 1.5 degrees Celsius, above 1.5 degrees Celsius over the industrial pre-industrial level, then they are committed. We already have a good place to start. Then if we put the sustainability solution forward, then there would be audience for it, there would be acceptance for it. Maybe individual businesses will push back a little bit, but we need to take our agenda in a more revolutionary way. Like global mobility team up till now has been asked to be more agile, more flexible, but here we need to be more visionary. We need to be more proactive in our approaches to push that agenda forward. And so when it comes to solutions for for sustainable air travel, the cost will go higher, but we can choose to go with airlines that use sustainable aviation fuel. We can choose direct flights, even though that is expensive. But we can also see that if we choose airlines where they give an option. There are certain airlines which give options for offsetting the environmental the carbon impact of the travel. So they ask you to participate in projects like renewable energy or reforestation and stuff like that. So we can actively choose those suppliers and those airlines, so we can reduce the sustainable, we can move towards sustainable air travel as well. So air travel is not necessarily bad, but we can make it more sustainable.
Absolutely. I'll chip in with a thought as well. I've been reading a few articles about how artificial intelligence could be an option to use that, to track data and get metrics and information. I know we talked about that earlier in the discussion. So I do think AI could be another solution for capturing that data. Our company recently published a report on the EU AI Act, and in an interesting kind of comparison, you have the CSRD and the EU AI Act taking place almost at the same time with a phased implementation. There is more information about that. We can share a link to our report on that. But I do think it's important to perhaps use the EU AI Act, or use AI, within the means of the AI Act to see what data we can potentially collect to solve the issue of not having enough data on global mobility. So I think that's also important. I'm conscious of time. We've got just over 10 minutes, but some really great questions. I'm just going to dig into a few of those. So I'll start with Nkumisa, who has asked, what practical steps can DSPs, that means destination service providers, take towards net zero? And Nkumisa has also said, we operate primarily across the African continent, and streamlining technology in remote areas isn't easy. So how do we overcome these challenges? I might start with Josh on that one, because we sort of talked about different locations. So we'll start with Josh, and maybe Attica will have some comments as well.
Yeah, I mean, regarding DSPs in particular, I think that also a lot depends on the areas that you're working in, and it kind of you have to put the emphasis on the DSPs themselves to an extent. I've done a lot of work before in the past in cities like Dublin, Zurich, London, and a lot of times you have to give them an essence of actually planning and being very thoughtful with their travel. Sometimes you see DSPs wanting to drive their assignees around to every single destination, and sometimes it's neither faster or better of an experience. You take someone that's maybe never lived in a big city before, you throw them into London, and then you're driving them around everywhere and not actually teaching them how to use the underground. Sometimes even actually doing something that might be slower to take them to property viewings, and you're taking them on the underground at the same time. Actually, it'll be a better experience for them, and at the same time they're getting immersed culturally into what everyday life is going to be like for them at the time. So I think that's some of the things that maybe DSPs can be doing, and even in some of the early information that they potentially provide them in terms of an overview on the city that they're moving in, just giving them some basic information on how public transport actually works in the area, and what's best to consider with that. It could even be when you're sort of suggesting some of the areas that they may want to be living in, actually saying, well, this area is best to live in because I know your office is here, and here's maybe some of the most effective ways of getting there, even though you're living a little bit further away. In terms of time, the public transport is great to getting there in that location. So I think that's on the DSP side of things. And in terms of maybe some of the countries that are working in Africa, we actually work in a lot of remote areas ourselves, and I think it can be more challenging in Africa because you tend to get a lot less collaboration with some of the government agencies that you maybe get in Europe. But a lot of our work that we do in Norway can be in very remote areas. And actually, on the immigration side of things, we had to schedule a number of police appointments for a big project of maybe sort of 50 or so people working. And the nearest police station where they could actually attend to do that was around a 3-hour drive. So what we were able to do, and working with the local agencies on this, was rather than sending 50 people to drive 3 hours down the road to attend an appointment that's maybe 10-15 minutes and then drive all the way back, we got a few people from the local office and the police office to drive out to the vessel and set up a mobile station on the vessel to actually handle all the applications that needed to be done. Obviously, that can't always be a solution, and I appreciate in Africa sometimes even attending immigration appointments can be difficult from experience of working in South Africa. But I think sometimes it's about asking the questions to those people that you are going to be working with and actually trying to come up with a solution, because sometimes if you can present them with a better option, like what happened with getting those to come to the vessel rather than getting everyone to go to the local police station, you can come up with solutions that work better for everyone.
That's so interesting, Josh. Thanks for your input on both of those questions. Attica, I'm sure you have a few thoughts to add to that.
Yeah, and in terms of leveraging settling in programs is something that I was thinking about, that the DSP services they have a settling in program, and that they can use those programs to add a sustainability agenda in that, to make the people, the person who is moved, more aware of more sustainable options in that area. It might not be the most advanced place, but it could still have a more sustainable option than the other. So there might be a dependency on car, but
Yeah.
other things that are there, like use of different means of transport, if explored, like Josh said, we have to explore, we have to ask the questions. But I really like this idea of leveraging the settling in programs, and because then it would actually align with what the global mobility is speaking and what the TSP provider is speaking. So we were both talking about sustainability in our communications with the employee, and actually suggesting them according to the local available sustainable means of working, and how to have a more sustainable stay in this host location.
Thank you, Attica. That was a really, really interesting response to the comments, and I think some really valuable points there. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to go with the last question, and then I'm going to ask you both if there's time for a final takeaway. Excellent question from Harry that we've not really touched on here. What the perspective is from the government level? I mean, that's obviously the highest level that we kind of work with from the global mobility standpoint. But have either of you noticed governments or countries being more inquisitive about sustainability practices? For example, if someone's moving from short-term to country or long-term, is the host government body concerned about how the assignee will get to the country, or the practices that are taken by the companies themselves? Love to hear if you have any insight on this at all. I'm not sure which countries have revealed information, but yeah, Attica, maybe we start with you and move on to Josh.
It's a very good question, Harry, but I have never had any experience myself of
That's
government.
yeah. Sure, Josh. How about yourself? I'm curious to know if
I think maybe not questions so much on directly, how you're getting to the country or something like that, but particularly for short-term work, at least within the renewable space, there's a lot of focus on what you're coming to the country to do, and a lot of incentives are being done maybe to actually allow people to come into the country if they're almost coming for the right reasons to do with carbon related. And if you're coming to do green work in Japan, that's going to be a lot easier on a short-term occasion versus maybe some other countries. And I think initiatives like that from the government are actually a good way that they maybe involve themselves a little bit more in the process and trying to make positive steps. But in terms of more than that, I don't think I've seen much more than that either.
Yeah, they're quite tight-lipped. Obviously, we read about the geopolitical situation and discussions on climate change at that level, but from my perspective, there's not much that's been disclosed as well from an immigration standpoint. We only have a few minutes left, so if we didn't answer any questions, we will absolutely reach out to you directly afterwards for some follow-up on that. But I wanted to allow the last 3 to 4 minutes to give a spotlight to Josh and Attica as to their final takeaways and final thoughts on this incredibly critical topic. Josh, I think I'll start with you. I'd love to know your final thoughts. Anything that you want to leave the audience with when they go home and kind of reflect on this matter. What have you got to kind of leave them with?
Yeah, I think global mobility is always going to be important in these conversations, and that's part of the reason why we move people to try and enhance this as an overall topic in whatever parts of the world. But I think that the sort of lasting point that I would leave things with is global mobility does need to have a voice at the table on these conversations, and to be able to do that, they need to come forward and actually suggest solutions. Now, a lot of the times, the solutions aren't maybe going to be most favourable of the bottom line, but it is actually about presenting the solutions and saying, look, here's how we can do things better, and this is what needs to be done. Here are some of our possible solutions, and actually getting a seat at the table to have those conversations. So I think that's the lasting comment I would leave things with.
Great, thank you, Josh. That's so kind of really valuable and important for the takeaway of the audience. And Attica, I'll leave the last word with you if you're happy to take that forward.
Yeah, I just want to say that it is a huge topic. It's very critical. It impacts every one of us, but we cannot change everything at the same time, and we have to go about it in small ways to have a bigger impact. And I would say to the starting point to create a bigger impact is to generate awareness uh, amongst us stakeholders in our program, so that the decisions that are being made are on sustainability criteria. And one thing that I really see lacking is also the sustainability training in our global mobility program. So to be built in our global mobility program, sustainability trainings, um, they will create the necessary buzz for making the change.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Attica. Thank you both for all those ideas and suggestions. I think there's so much for people to take away and kind of potentially implement into their own business practices. So it's been incredibly helpful. Few thank yous to wrap up. Thank you, Attica, for your contribution, your time. We've had a few calls to plan this. Josh, again, thank you so much for your contributions. It's been a really kind of organic, natural conversation. I really loved kind of moderating it and just hearing your thoughts and your passion for this topic. Of course, a huge thank you to Nicole, who is our sort of MVP behind the camera that's helped put this together at Centuro. And finally, most importantly, look, we put these webinars on for the audience. So thank you so much for everyone that's kind of taken the time to be with us for this hour of discussion, ideas, and kind of thoughts on what we can do to achieve that goal of reaching net zero. It's a continuous discussion. We're going to have more conversations about this. So look forward to those. Look forward to the content that we're going to be producing over the coming months. And I'm going to wrap this up by saying, yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure and look forward to the next discussion. Thank you so much.